And now, after a bit of a delay, we're finally starting on Kafka, and we're going to look at some of his novels and other works. Some of his most famous works are actually short stories or longish short stories. There's the famous one about the man who turns into a giant beetle. That's Metamorphosis, and then there's The Trial, which we'll look at today, which is, as the name suggests, the story of a man who's accused of some crime and is to try and find out what it is that he's accused of and how he proceeds. Anyway, so because we've been looking at people like Sartre and Camus and briefly Céline, some of them, particularly the first two, are regarded as these sort of what you call existentialist people. And Kafka seems to have been put into that category as well by critics, I suppose, and people who should know. Although, in fact, he died in 1924, so he'd really had his life and written his books and died before most of those other people really got started. And I don't think he really would have considered himself to be a part of any particular philosophical movement. I suppose there are some reasons, as we'll find out, why people might put him into that group. But I suppose the main thing about him that would suggest it's part of that is the sense of not exactly unreality, but a lack of meaning or a lack of relevance, or how things that happen don't really fit together, or one thing doesn't lead to another. There doesn't seem to be a definite link or a cause or a logical progression from one thing to another in his works, and they just seem to be so strange and hard to understand. So that's the thing really about Kafka. People use that adjective Kafkaesque, which I think refers to this idea of just strangeness and a kind of a dreamlike quality. And I think that's, as we'll look at that, I think a dream is the right way to describe them, really. So people find them hard to read. And there was a television comedy program back in the 1950s and 60s called Hancock's Half Hour. Tony Hancock was this English comedian, and he played the role, possibly semi-autobiographical, of a would-be celebrated actor, and he'd had moderate success. The character had, Hancock himself had quite a lot of success because he was a television celebrity, but the character had moderate success, always dreamed of being a great Shakespearean actor or something important, and a lot of the comedy revolved around his having kind of intellectual pretensions to really be moving in the arty circle and understanding all those things when he didn't really. And so a lot of the comedy of that was to do with his ambition, his foiled ambitions, I suppose, and his sense of disappointment. So very, very much like the programs that Ricky Gervais made in more recent times about the same idea of would-be actors who are desperate to get success and don't, or if they do get it, then it turns out to not be what they wanted. It's spoiled and perverted in some way, and they would be better off not to have it in the first place. Anyway, so that's Tony Hancock. So the point of that, the relevance of that to Kafka, is that one of his shows, he decides he's going to really do something important, read something of value rather than all the frivolous television stuff he's been watching. So he decides to start reading Kafka's The Trial. He sits himself down in an armchair, opens up the front page full of enthusiasm, and the clock on the wall moves to about 4 hours later, and he hasn't got off the first page. So eventually he decides, in disgust, he's going to abandon the attempt to read Kafka. So the suggestion there is that Kafka is unreadable, so dense and incomprehensible that you can't actually read it, which is not really true. The actual language of a Kafka story is quite commonplace, and the events that he describes are quite normal. A person meets another person, the person is told to make an appointment, he has to find an address, he goes there, he meets other people there, they direct him, he gets into trouble with certain people, he tries to defend himself, he is attracted to a certain woman or she's attracted to him. It's all quite normal, and the language is quite straightforward, so there's nothing particularly abstruse or philosophical or scientific. There's no complicated scientific jargon. The only thing that's hard to understand is how it all fits together. So it's easy to read in one sense, but it's just hard to make sense of it in your mind, really. And I think dreamlike is probably the best way to describe it. In a dream, things happen that in our waking life would have no connection, and we couldn't see how one would lead to another. But in a dream, they do seem to lead to one, and one leads to another, and we don't question it. It just seems normal that it should be that way, and that's the nature of a dream. So, as we said, Kafka died in 1924. He was born in the late 1800s. And I think that was the period when most of Freud's work was done and published. And there's no real direct evidence of this, but I would suspect that Kafka may have had some contact with Freud. He was born in Czechoslovakia and spoke German most of his life. Presumably, large parts of Czechoslovakia presumably were inhabited by German-speaking people. Part of his life he lived in Berlin, and that's where he worked, and all his books were written in German. So one would assume that in that time, in that atmosphere, that environment, he would have been exposed to the works of Freud, presumably. And obviously we know a lot of Freud's works were dealing with dreams and how the unconscious expresses itself through dreams and how we can tap into the unconscious by looking at those dreams. And I think that's maybe Kafka came upon the same idea independently, I'm not sure really. So he certainly doesn't ever reference Freud at all. One has the impression that maybe there was an influence there. So interestingly, if you read Freud, his language is also quite straightforward, even though he's talking about these quite novel and startling in some ways ideas and quite profound ideas, but he doesn't use scientific terminology at all. He just talks in quite straightforward, plain language, which anyone can understand. So he's, like Kafka, he intends to be understood, but the reader, understanding, must make some effort to penetrate to the depth of those ideas that are being put across, which is quite the reverse of what you find if you read scientific papers, particularly psychology papers and research and so on in that realm, but in any scientific realm. It's all full of scientific jargon, which it's very hard to understand words that you don't know unless you're a professional in that field, and even concepts that you doubt that they really have much meaning. And it seems really that those works are written with the intention that they not be understood, or at least not except by a small inner group of professionals that share that discipline. So they're not, I may be unjust in saying that, but it seems they don't intend the average person, in inverted commas, to understand what they're saying, but they want to give the impression that they are saying something quite significant. But if you make the effort to really try to penetrate them and get through those words, you actually find there's not really much of any meaning there at all. Anyway, but that's all beside the point, I guess. So we're saying that Kafka's works are dreamlike. So, for example, he might be someone is in a small room, which suddenly opens into a large room. So at one stage, the hero of the trial is sent to find the place where his trial is to be held. There's a courtroom, and he's given the address, the street name, and a number. He finds a big building which is inhabited by various tenants and very small businesses and people doing lots of different things. No sign of anything that looks like a courtroom. He's given directions which are misleading. Eventually walks through a door and he's suddenly inside a large courtroom with all the attendants and everything in place. And in another section he visits a kind of someone living in a garret in a kind of an impoverished section of the town. I think an artist lives there, and he's a man of some importance in the legal world, apparently, strangely enough. And he opens a window in the side of his little shabby room, and immediately that leads back into the courtroom again. So those are certainly attributes of dreams. I suppose the other possibility is that all these experiences could be not dreams, but paranoid delusions, possibly. So that's certainly a possibility too, I suppose. So we'll get on to the legal problem that the character faces a bit soon, but the other interesting thing that crops up in this book, The Trial, and through a lot of other Kafka's other big novels are The Castle and America, and something which occurs in all of those, which is often not commented on so much, is his relationships with women. So he seems to just meet a young woman, finds her attractive, she finds him attractive, and they immediately are in a kind of an intense, intimate relationship, almost without any introduction or courtship or anything. They just seem to have almost instantly become intimate, but then quite often that ceases straight away as well. It happens several times within the trial, and one wonders what does that mean really. And I mean, Kafka himself was quite young when he died, so all his life really he was a comparatively young man, and presumably quite a good-looking young man. So you one would imagine that young women would have been interested in him, and he would have been interested in them. So one kind of wonders what's really happening. Is he just recounting the experience of just seeing a woman for the first time, being attracted by her appearance, having a kind of a flirtatious interaction with her, and in his mind, or in a way, he's already in a relationship with her, even though there is no real relationship at all, and he can imagine what could happen, that they could be involved in that relationship, but then they can just walk away from it again. That seems to be what's going on there, really, somehow. But as I said, it's characteristic of all three of these novels, and we'll come to them later. At one stage in the trial, towards the end of the trial, when the character is getting to quite a critical point in his own trial, where there could be serious consequences for him, he has to visit a particular lawyer who is apparently going to be really important in his case and could offer a way out for him. But while he's there, the lawyer's servant girl, who's possibly also his mistress, comes on the scene, and immediately the character of the novel is attracted to her, and then she leaves the room. He's involved in important discussions with this lawyer, and a friend of his is helping him with the contact with the lawyer, and he hears a loud crash in the other room where the girl has dropped a plate. So as soon as the character hears this loud crash, he immediately departs from the room where he's discussing his case with the lawyer and his friend, goes into the other room and enters into an intimate relationship with this girl, even though to do that he's had to leave behind all of the important aspects of the handling of his case, and he's reprimanded by his friend later for having jeopardised the whole outcome of his case because this crash invited him into the presence of this girl, and he gave everything up for that. And that's very much reminiscent of an episode in a novel called Thomas Mann, the German novelist, wrote a novel called The Magic Mountain about people in a TB sanatorium in Switzerland who are, because they've all got TB, they're all presumably under the threat of fairly imminent death, although they might be cured. But anyway, this character's there. One of the other people there is the attractive young woman. The first time he encounters her, she comes into the communal dining room where they're living, and she comes through a door, and the character hears a very loud crashing sound. But probably he doesn't really. There's probably no sound at all. He just opens the door and it might bang, but in his mind there's a loud crashing sound. The woman comes through the door, and instantly he's in love with her, and spends much of the novel trying to approach her, although he's very diffident about doing so. Eventually he does. So there seems to be something similar. There's a loud banging sound somewhere in his, maybe it's a real sound, maybe it's just something that goes on internally, and that immediately draws him or binds him to this woman. Yeah, so that's another interesting thing about Kafka. So the legality, the case and everything, the accusation, we might have to come to that in the next episode probably.